There's a Norse god who once traded away the single most powerful weapon in existence, a sword that fights on its own, swinging itself without anyone even holding it, just to get a date. And because of that one decision, made in a single moment of desperation, he'll walk into Ragnarok completely unarmed, facing an enemy he has absolutely no way to beat. This is the story of Freyr, a god you probably haven't heard much about yet on this channel, and the journey his most loyal servant took on his behalf through fire, past guard dogs, through failed bribes, real threats, and a curse dark enough to finally make a giantess agree to something she clearly didn't want. Quick introduction. Since this is the first time we're really diving into this god, Freyr is one of the Vanir, the second tribe of Norse gods, separate from Odin, Thor, and the rest of the Aesir who live in Asgard. The Vanir and the Aesir actually fought a war against each other long before this story takes place, the same war that, if you remember from an earlier video, accidentally created Aesir when both sides spat into a shared vessel to seal their peace treaty. As part of that same truce, hostages were exchanged between the two tribes, and that's actually how Freyr, his sister Freyr, and their father Gerd ended up living among the Aesir gods in Asgard in the first place, despite being Vanir by blood, where Odin represents wisdom, obsession, and war, and Thor represents raw physical strength. Freyr represents something completely different: fertility, prosperity, sunlight, rainfall, and peace. He's the god farmers actually prayed to for a good harvest, associated with abundance, good weather, and general well-being, worshipped by ordinary people who mostly just wanted their crops to grow and their families to stay fed through the winter. He's not framed as a warrior god by nature or by temperament. But despite that, he does own one of the most powerful weapons in the entire 9 realms, a magic sword capable of fighting completely on its own, swinging itself through enemies without anyone directing the blade at all, an object value enough that entire kingdoms would go to war over it. Keep that sword in mind as we go, because it matters far more than you'd expect for a peace-loving fertility god to be carrying something like that around. And by the end of this story, it won't be his anymore. This story begins with what looks like a fairly small mistake. Freyr, for reasons the surviving myths never fully explain, maybe curiosity, maybe simple opportunity while Odin happened to be elsewhere, ends up sitting on Gerd, Odin's high throne in Asgard. This isn't just any chair. It's the one seat in all the 9 realms that lets whoever sits on it see into literally every single realm at once, watching events unfold anywhere in the entire cosmos. It's not really Freyr's throne to use, and it's generally understood that this privilege belongs to Odin alone. But Freyr climbs up anyway, and looks out across the 9 realms from that impossibly high vantage point, taking in farmlands, oceans, mountain ranges, and every corner of existence spread out beneath him all at once. And somewhere out there, deep in the land of the giants, he sees her, a giantess named Gerd, walking toward her father's home, her arms lifted to open the door in front of her. And the moment the myth describes this scene, it makes clear that Freyr is instantly, completely, hopelessly struck by her. Not simple admiration, not passing curiosity, total, overwhelming obsession, the kind the old sources describe as physically overtaking him, making it genuinely difficult for him to function normally afterward, as if one glance from a throne he wasn't even supposed to be sitting on had completely rewritten his priorities. Freyr returns to his own hall in Asgard, and from that point forward, he's essentially a different god entirely. He stops eating properly. He stops speaking to the people around him, withdrawing almost completely. He simply sits alone, hour after hour, consumed entirely by thoughts of a giantess he saw exactly once, from an enormous distance, through a throne belonging to someone else. This goes on long enough, and severely enough, that the other gods around him genuinely start to worry. This isn't framed as simple lovesickness in the myth, it's described with real concern, almost like an illness settling over him. Eventually, Gerd, his own father, decides enough time has passed without answers, and sends Skirnir, Freyr's personal servant, and by most accounts, his closest and most trusted companion, to go find out directly what's actually wrong with his son, since Freyr himself won't explain it to anyone else, not even to his own father, despite everyone around him clearly noticing something is seriously wrong. Skirnir approaches Freyr directly, and after enough patient, gentle pushing, Freyr finally admits what actually happened, that he climbed onto Odin's throne. Saw a giantess named Gerd from across the realms, and hasn't been able to think clearly about anything else since that single moment. He explains that her beauty was so overwhelming, so radiant, that it practically lit up the sky and the sea around her, at least in his memory of that one brief glimpse he managed to catch. Freyr admits, with what the myth frames as genuine despair, that he believes he'll never actually have her. That giants and gods aren't exactly known for peaceful marriages under normal circumstances, let alone one built on nothing but an unannounced, one-sided glance from a throne he wasn't even supposed to be using in the first place. Skirnir, hearing all of this, and clearly moved by how badly his friend and master is suffering, offers to go himself, to travel deep into Jotunheim and act as a messenger on Freyr's behalf, to find out whether this entire obsession could actually become something real, or whether Freyr is simply going to waste away over someone he'll never actually meet. Freyr agrees to the plan immediately, desperate for any real chance of making this work. But Skirnir, practical and clear-headed even in the middle of his friend's emotional crisis, points out that traveling alone into hostile giant territory carries genuine risk. And if he's going to attempt any kind of negotiation on Freyr's behalf, he's going to need real protection along the way, and real leverage once he actually arrives. Freyr, without much hesitation at all, hands over his own horse, one specifically capable of safely crossing the wall of flickering flame that surrounds Gerd's home. A detail that becomes important very quickly once the journey actually begins. And then, almost as an afterthought in the way the myth presents it, but something that's going to matter enormously later in an entirely different story. Freyr also hands over his sword, the same magic sword capable of fighting completely on its own. He gives up his single most powerful possession without much complaint or hesitation at all, simply because it might help secure this one meeting. It's genuinely worth pausing on that decision for a moment, because it's going to come back around in a much bigger, much more consequential way. For later, during Ragnarok itself, Skirnir sets out immediately on Freyr's horse, riding hard toward Jotunheim, and as he crosses out of Asgard into the realm of the giants, the entire landscape around him begins to change. The comfortable, ordered world of the gods gradually giving way to something rougher, colder, and noticeably more hostile the further he travels. Along the way, he passes through darkness and dangerous, and even terrain that would stop most ordinary travelers completely in their tracks. But with Freyr's horse beneath him, one capable of crossing flame and shadow without hesitation or fear, he keeps pushing forward without slowing down at any point. This isn't framed in the myth as some casual diplomatic visit between neighboring realms. This is a genuine journey through hostile, unfamiliar territory, undertaken entirely on behalf of someone else. Freyr never leaves Asgard himself throughout any part of this story, choosing instead to stay behind and wait while his servant does all the actual work and takes on all the actual risk in his place. Eventually, after a long and difficult ride, Skirnir reaches Gerd's home, a hall completely surrounded by flickering, continuous flame, which explains exactly why Freyr's specific horse, one capable of crossing fire safely without being harmed, was absolutely necessary for this particular journey in the first place. Guarding the entrance are fierce hounds, positioned specifically to keep unwanted visitors away, and it takes real effort and some clever handling on Skirnir's part to get past them without serious incident. Once safely inside, he finally comes face to face with Gerd herself for the first time, and immediately begins the actual task he came here for, convincing a giantess who has genuinely never met Freyr, has no personal connection to him whatsoever, and has absolutely no obvious reason to trust some random messenger showing up uninvited at her home, that she should nonetheless agree to marry a god she's never even seen in person, based entirely on second-hand claims about how deeply he apparently longs for her. Skirnir starts the negotiation diplomatically, offering Gerd a set of gifts on Freyr's behalf: 11 golden apples, rare and genuinely precious. Exactly the kind of offering that would normally impress almost anyone in the 9 realms. Gerd refuses immediately, completely unmoved by either the gold or the rare fruit itself. She makes clear she has no real interest in material wealth, and even less interest in marrying some distant god she's never met, purely on the basis of gifts delivered second-hand by his servant. Skirnir, undeterred by the first refusal, tries again almost right away, this time offering her Draupnir, the legendary self-multiplying ring that Odin himself possesses and treasures, an item of genuine, enormous value. Arguably one of the single most powerful magical objects that exists anywhere across all of Norse mythology. Gerd refuses that offer too, just as firmly and immediately as the first one. She already has plenty of wealth through her own father's considerable resources, and gold, however rare or magical, simply isn't going to be what changes her mind about marrying a complete stranger she's never met. This is exactly where the negotiation starts to shift tone, and where this particular myth becomes genuinely uncomfortable to watch unfold, even by the standards of Norse mythology. Skirnir, having now failed twice with generosity and kindness, begins escalating quickly toward open threats instead. He warns Gerd directly that he'll cut off her father's head if she continues to refuse, drawing the sword he's carrying, Freyr's own magic sword, the one capable of fighting entirely on its own, as visible physical proof that he's completely serious about following through on the threat. Gerd, notably, and somewhat remarkably given the situation, doesn't back down at all in this moment. She responds directly that she isn't afraid of him, that her own father is more than capable of handling any conflict Skirnir might actually attempt to start, and that simple threats of violence clearly aren't going to be enough to convince her of anything, either, regardless of how impressive the sword itself might be. Skirnir, having now failed with both generous gifts and direct threats of physical violence, shifts towards something considerably darker, an actual curse. He tells Gerd, in extended and genuinely disturbing detail, that if she continues refusing, he will personally strike her with a magic wand and curse her to an entire lifetime of complete isolation, unable to ever find happiness with anyone at all, doomed to sit alone on the edge of a distant cliff indefinitely, tormented and thoroughly miserable, permanently cut off from any real joy for the remainder of her existence. He describes this curse at considerable length and with unsettling specificity, making unmistakably clear that this isn't an empty threat meant simply to scare her, but something he genuinely possesses both the magical power and the stated intention to actually carry out if she keeps refusing. It's a genuinely uncomfortable turn for the myth to take, and worth acknowledging plainly and directly rather than glossing over. This entire sequence isn't framed as any kind of romantic negotiation between equals. It's coercion, backed by real and demonstrated magical power, specifically aimed at forcing consent through fear rather than ever earning it honestly. Faced with a curse severe enough to guarantee permanent, lifelong misery, described in enough vivid and specific detail that it clearly and visibly terrifies her by this point, Gerd finally relents and agrees. She agrees to meet Freyr in person, setting a specific time and location for their actual meeting, 9 nights later, in a quiet forest grove known as Bari. The myth itself presents this moment almost entirely as a successful resolution, a negotiation that ultimately worked out in Freyr's favor after some difficulty. But it's worth noting plainly, without softening it, that Gerd's eventual agreement comes only after direct threats of violence against her own father, followed immediately by a curse specifically designed to permanently destroy any chance she'd ever have at happiness for the rest of her life, not because Skirnir ever actually won her over, honestly through persuasion, patience, or genuine connection. It's one of the more morally complicated moments across all of Norse mythology, and notably, it's a moment the original story never really resolves, explains away, or condemns on its own terms. Skirnir travels back to Asgard immediately with the news, and finds Freyr waiting anxiously outside his own hall, clearly desperate for any kind of update after days of silence, isolation, and mounting anxiety while he waited. When Skirnir tells him that Gerd has formally agreed to meet him in 9 nights' time, Freyr's reaction, according to the myth, is something closer to pure agony than any real relief. 9 full nights suddenly feels absolutely unbearable to a god who's already been thoroughly consumed by longing for weeks on end at this point. He famously laments, in lines still quoted from the original poems, that even a single night can feel unbearably long when you're waiting for something you want that badly, and 9 entire nights stretched out ahead of him now seems almost physically impossible to endure, without breaking down completely. It's a strange emotional beat in the story, the god whose obsession caused this entire chain of events in the first place. Now suffering through the wait for a meeting that was secured through threats he apparently either doesn't fully know about, or simply doesn't dwell on once he hears the meeting itself is actually happening. The surviving myths don't actually describe the meeting itself in much real detail. What specifically happens between Freyr and Gerd once they finally meet in the grove at Bari stays largely in red, and left mostly to implication rather than direct narration. What we do know clearly is the eventual outcome: Freyr and Gerd do go on to marry, becoming husband and wife. And Gerd afterward is counted among the goddesses of Norse mythology from that point forward, despite her giant origins and her family's clear connection to Jotunheim rather than Asgard. The entire pursuit that started with nothing more than an accidental glimpse from Odin's borrowed throne escalated steadily through to failed gift offers and eventually outright coercion, ultimately ends in an actual, lasting marriage, at least as far as the surviving written myths choose to record the ending. What happens to Gerd afterward gets even less attention in the surviving sources than the courtship itself. She leaves her father's home, crosses that same wall of flame Skirnir once rode through, and joins Freyr in Asgard, taking her place among gods she has no blood connection to whatsoever. Married to someone she agreed to meet only under threat of a devastating curse. Later sources do occasionally list her among Norse goddesses with real reverence, suggesting that whatever happened after that first meeting in the grove, the marriage was treated seriously and permanently within the mythology, rather than as some brief or forgotten arrangement. Still, it's a jarring gap in the story an entire life uprooted, and the myth simply moves on without ever circling back to how Gerd herself felt about any of it, long after the threats and the curse had already done their work. But here's exactly where this story stops being just a strange and comfortable romance, and becomes something with real, permanent consequences reaching far beyond this single myth. Freyr gave away his magic sword to Skirnir right at the very start of this entire journey, as both payment and practical incentive for undertaking such a dangerous mission on his behalf. That sword never actually comes back to him. Freyr simply doesn't have it anymore, permanently, for the remainder of Norse mythology, all the way through to the very end. And this isn't some minor detail that the myths quietly forget about afterward. It gets referenced directly later, specifically in the context of Ragnarok itself. When the final battle eventually comes, when every single god faces the specific enemy fated to kill them, Freyr will face Gerd, the fire giant destined to burn the entire world during Ragnarok. And Freyr, without his sword, without the one weapon genuinely capable of fighting on his behalf even without him wielding it directly, will lose that fight completely. He'll die in the final battle, at least partly because of a single decision made here, centuries earlier in mythological time, born out of nothing more than obsession over a giantess he saw exactly once, from a throne that was never even his to sit on in the first place. It's genuinely worth sitting with what this entire story reveals about Freyr as a character, once you look past the surface-level romance framing. He's not portrayed anywhere as a warrior or a schemer, the way Odin or Loki consistently are throughout Norse mythology. He's fundamentally a god of peace, prosperity, and abundance, who makes one deeply personal, emotionally driven decision, giving away his single most powerful weapon for the sake of something that mattered to him, intensely and personally, and that one choice ends up following him for the rest of his mythological existence, all the way to his eventual death during Ragnarok. It's a very human kind of mistake, in many ways, wrapped up in genuinely divine consequences, and it makes Freyr one of the more quietly tragic figures across the entire mythology, even though this specific myth is framed, on its surface, as a successful love story with what looks like a happy ending. It's also genuinely worth acknowledging Skirnir's role in all of this, since he's really the one who accomplishes everything within this entire story, the dangerous journey itself, the failed negotiations, the escalating threats, and finally the curse that actually secures the agreement. Freyr never leaves Asgard at any point in the story. He never speaks to Gerd directly until the actual meeting at Bari itself, which the myth barely describes in any detail at all. Every single thing that ultimately secures this marriage is accomplished entirely by his servant, using gifts for